Good morning and welcome to the 12th meeting in 2017 of the Rural Economy and Connectivity Committee. I would ask you all please to put your mobile phones on silent, and no apologies have been received. Agenda item 1 is a declaration of interest, and I welcome our newest member, Fulton McGregor, to the committee, and in accordance with section 3 of the Code of Conduct, I would ask him to declare any interest relevant to the committee's remit.
Thanks, Convener. No interest to declare.
Thank you very much. Item 2 is to take a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to decide to consider the budget review process interim report, which is agenda item 6, and I'd like to do this in private. Is everyone agreed? Yes. We're agreed. Agenda item 3, we're moving now to take evidence on the implications on the outcome of the EU referendum for Scotland in relation to agriculture, forestry and fisheries. Before I welcome the panel that is here, I would just like to ask if there is any members of the committee who would like to make a declaration of interest relating to agriculture or forestry. Peter.
Yes, Convener, I declare an interest in an agricultural business in the North East and refer members to my register.
Stuart.
I have a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income.
Thank you. And I would like to declare an interest that I'm a partner in a farming business, and I refer full details of my interest in the Register of Interests. So I'd like to welcome, if I may, Fergus Ewing, the Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Connectivity, and Mike Russell, the Minister for UK Negotiations on Scotland's place in Europe. The ministers are joined by David Barnes, the Director of Agriculture and Environment, Alan Gibb, Head of the Sea Fisheries Division, and Jonathan Taylor, the Head of Secretariat and Communications at the Forestry Commission. I believe, Mike Russell, you're going to start with an opening statement, and I would ask, if possible, that you keep it to within 2 minutes or as close as possible to that.
That's the second warning I've had from you, Convener. I shall pay attention to it. Thank you for the invitation. We're both grateful to have the opportunity to discuss the UK's departure from the EU in relation specifically to agriculture, forestry and fisheries. We followed the committee's work on the impacts of Brexit, but of course events are moving very fast, and you don't require me to tell you that today. As a result, then I think most of the information will come to you in questioning. If I make 2 points. Firstly, this is a crucial time. Scotland didn't vote to leave the EU, but recognising that the rest of the UK voted differently, the Scottish Government has put forward a compromise proposals in this document, Scotland's Place in Europe, with which I'm sure you are familiar. These proposals were a genuine compromise. They were designed to square the circle by addressing Scotland's interests, and particularly our interest in remaining in the single market, while enabling the UK Government to respect the referendum result elsewhere in the UK. Last month, unfortunately, the UK Government rejected that compromise, whilst the Scottish Parliament voted in favour of the First Minister's proposals that the people of Scotland be given a choice about their future. That means that the Scottish Government is working to deliver the right to choose that the Parliament approved, but at the same time, we must, as the First Minister said, continue to stand up for Scotland's interests during the process of Brexit negotiations. And the interests that this committee represents are, of course, very significant, both in terms of the devolved settlement, in terms of European competence, in terms of their impact on Scotland. I'm very happy to talk in more detail about all of those issues during questions.
Thank you very much. Fergus, would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you for that, Convener. In the event of Brexit, the Scottish Government has made it clear what we see as the key issues, and I welcome the opportunity to run over in a bit of detail what these are. Firstly, CAP funding is a hugely significant issue. Between 2014 and 2020, Scotland will receive 4.6 billion euros, around £400 million sterling per annum from the EU across the 2 pillars of the CAP. That's hugely important to rural Scotland. Whilst the UK has given some limited assurance, which is welcome as far as it goes, it doesn't really apply to post-Brexit at all. There are questions, Convener, about funding, but no answers, and that is despite engagement, active engagement by myself and Ms Cunningham on these matters. On trade, we've made clear single market access is essential for agriculture, food and aquaculture. Absolutely essential. Seafood is far more important for Scotland than the rest of the UK, even although farmed salmon is the UK's second and, on occasion, top food export, and yet the UK government won't share their list of priority countries for trade agreements with us. Our salmon industry has made clear the importance of the single market for the future of its business, the importance of free movement of goods and of people, and they've highlighted non-tariff barriers as an area of significant concern. Around 8,000 people are employed in the food and drink sector are non-UK EU nationals, and our soft fruit and vegetable sectors employ up to 15,000 non-UK seasonal workers each year for harvest in summer and autumn. No one knows with certainty what the future position of these absolutely essential workers are. Again, questions, no answers. And finally, there's the issue of repatriation of powers. Fishing and agriculture are devolved, and our position is that all the powers should come to this Parliament. That has been pursued by myself, by Michael Russell, by Rosanna Cunningham. Questions have been put, but again, Convener, no answers. I am persevering with this process of meetings, and I will be in London tomorrow, unless, of course, the meeting is unilaterally cancelled by the UK government, as it has been in the past, and I will seek, on behalf of the government, the answers as well as the questions, and we will take it from there.
Thank you very much. There are 12 themes that we'd like to explore during today's meeting, and the first one is going to be introduced by Stuart.
Thank you very much, Convener. And I want to talk about relationships with other administrations in these islands and the UK on the common cause of getting the best outcome. And in particular, where agriculture is concerned, the Minister for Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy and Connectivity referred to knowing the financial support up to 2020, but not post-Brexit. And I just wonder, in relation to the history we've had in matters like convergence payments, which have not been distributed on agricultural need, whether there are any particular areas of common cause and work to ensure that agriculture, which is disproportionately important in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, will continue to get the proportion of the level of support. Is this something that's been worked on with Wales, with Northern Ireland, indeed with the dependencies for that matter as well, and other interests in England that are affected by poor decisions that could be made in this area? Just how's it going? Now, that's a long question. I know that the convener is hoping for comparatively short answers and probably shorter questions.
I think, Fergus, that's directed at you.
Yes, well, thank you, Convener. We have sought to engage very constructively with the UK. So have our counterparts in Wales and Northern Ireland. There has been a group which has met twice on the 8th of November last year and 23rd of February this year. The DEFRA Secretary of State cancelled a meeting scheduled for the 26th of January against the wishes of the devolved ministers. We have pursued these meetings positively and constructively, but sadly there has simply been no information, Convener. No information whatsoever on anything. Now, that's unfortunate, but that is the reality. The second question is about convergence, and perhaps just a brief explanation that the EU provided a fund, essentially, to assist the convergence, a kind of moving together of the real rates of return for farmers across the EU. The UK only qualified for this money because of Scotland. If it had not been for Scotland, the UK would have received zero. Instead, because and only because of the fact that the rate per hectare in Scotland is way, way below the EU average, the UK was entitled to convergence funding. That funding was in the region of £190 million, and my predecessor argued that because that money came to the UK because of Scotland, and only because of Scotland, that money should be received for the benefit of the farmers in Scotland who receive per hectare far, far lower than our friends down south or in other parts of the UK. That, convener, sadly, is not what happened. Now, this Parliament has debated in the previous session this matter before. My predecessor sought and obtained an agreement from the UK government for a review that would be carried out into this matter. And Mr Patterson, I believe, Owen Patterson, the former DEFRA Cabinet Secretary, agreed to a review. However, that review has not been carried out. That was a pledge that, without being political about it, simply has not yet been fulfilled. Therefore, when I accepted when I became Cabinet Secretary, I pursued this matter by seeking a discussion with my counterpart, Andrea Leadsom. I had a meeting in this very room, actually, last autumn, and she undertook to look at the issue and revert to us thereon. We are waiting for a substantive response. Now, this is hugely important because this is £190 million, and that money should have come to Scotland. And it's not an EU issue. It's between Scotland and the UK. And therefore, I do hope that all members of this Parliament will agree that Scotland should receive, Scotland's farmers should receive the benefit of this funding, specifically designed to tackle the lowest, I think, in the EU hectareage rate of return on average. That's what the money was for. That's what it should be used for. It has not been used for that purpose. And believe you and me, that will be pursued over the coming weeks.
My other question, which is quite brief and probably it can generate quite a brief answer. Given that Scotland and the convergence issue illustrates this, gets far greater than population share of support for agriculture, is there an opportunity for common cause with the other jurisdictions on this issue to make sure that our share of support for agriculture is preserved broadly, or are there indications this is simply a message that's neither being heard nor responded to?
Mike.
Well, I mean, I'm an optimist by nature, and therefore I'm working positively to procure what Andrea Leadsom promised, namely a sensible, reasoned discussion, and then perhaps a solution. That's what I want. I'm interested in practical results, convener, and that, therefore, is what I am doing. And this is a good opportunity to report to Parliament for what I have been doing. And I do hope that all members will support our efforts in this regard. And of course, we also work with our colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland very closely. Scotland's per hectareage rate was only 45% of the EU average. England, Wales and Northern Ireland were all above the 90% threshold set by the Commission. And the purpose of the Convergence Fund was that the EU said that all countries receiving less than 90% of the EU average should close the gap by 1/3 by 2019. And therefore, on the face of it, convener, I've got the details here. I will undertake to write to the committee with the full details, the full facts. I won't labour the argument by going over them now. But this is a crystal clear case of money coming to Scotland where the UK government promised something where they haven't delivered it yet. And I do think that people should deliver their promises in government.
Cabinet Secretary, we will take you up on your offer, and I think if we can leave that there. And if I could ask just on a matter of etiquette, Mike had signalled that he wanted to come in on that, and I was going to take him first. So if I can just ask, if I may, if you both look at me, and I will indicate which way to go, Mike. Sorry, you wanted to come
I just wanted to make a point about the point that Stuart Stevenson raised about working together on agricultural issues. Although the JMCEN has not had the opportunity to discuss agricultural issues in detail, largely because there has not been an opportunity to resolve the issue of how the agricultural issues and the frameworks might be devolved, and that has only begun to emerge now through the white paper that the UK government has brought forward. We have identified in Wales and with part of the previous Northern Ireland executive common interests in agricultural issues as being major matters which would require to be discussed during the negotiations in JMCEN. Now, those have not, that's a JMC European Negotiation Committee. That committee has been deeply unsatisfactory, but the members from the devolved administrations have made common cause on a range of issues, and agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and a number of others have been identified as key areas for the next phase, that is the post-Article 50 phase.
I think we're going to move on to the next theme. Rhoda, if you'd like to start us on that, please.
Yes. Can I ask what work has been carried out to assess the impact of CAP, whether positive or negative, looking forward to what we might be looking at for the future? So is there any work being taken place?
Well, we obviously carry out a number of methods of assessing the impact of CAP across a variety of ways. And of course, CAP provides a number of forms of payment. Particularly important for Scotland is the support it provides for sheep and beef farming. And it does so in a number of ways through ELFAS, through various other schemes. And it's important to evaluate the success of our policies, and we regularly use independent experts to do it. We've also established the Russell Griggs Group to look at how we can support profitable farming whilst meeting our environmental commitments. And we're all aware that farmers' primary role is to produce food for the nation, and food security, I think, is moving up the agenda, Convener, if I may say so. But also, I think it's fair to say that farmers and crofters are the custodians of the countryside. If we didn't have hill farming, what would the land look like? I'm sure members of the committee, yourself and others, will be very well aware of the huge role that farmers play as custodians of the environment. And perhaps that's something that we don't pay sufficient heed to, and we need to evaluate a bit more. So there are a number of other methods to answer the question, such as auditing of independent assessment. But I hope that the answer I've given is sufficient, so I'll just leave it there.
Yeah. So, just at this stage, is there anything coming forward from that that would indicate that you would maybe want to carry that forward into a Scottish support programme in the future, or indeed if there are parts of CAP that you wouldn't want to include?
Yes, well, we do believe very strongly that we need to continue to provide a means of supporting the high-quality farming for food that operates in Scotland. We are a high-quality food producer, and we will remain so. We will not compete at the lowest cost, lowest quality, nor should we. And therefore, it's important that whatever the future may hold, that we continue to provide support for the high-quality farming in Scotland, and that includes beef, sheep, poultry, pig, soft fruit, potatoes, across, frankly, the realm. We need to recognise that that needs to be supported to a greater or lesser extent. I think the particular areas of support are sheep and beef farming from hill farming. Perhaps I could just say as a point of information that, as members will know, we have announced a decision to proceed with the 80% ELFAS parachute option for next year, but we have also asked the UK government that for 2019 that we should seek support then, because that would possibly be post-Brexit if that goes ahead, in order to maintain support in principle for ELFAS. ELFAS is essential for Scotland. We cannot do without it. We have been asking Ms Leadsom in particular for her support in recognising that we must maintain hill farming in Scotland. Without ELFAS, we cannot do that. And I've asked for clarification from the UK government to accept in principle that that is agreed. And I do hope that at the meeting I will have tomorrow, if Ms Leadsom is appearing at it, that she will answer in the affirmative.
Peter wants to follow up. Maybe I can bring Peter and then come back to you if I may, Rhoda.
Thanks, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I mean, you've made much of the difficulty between the negotiations in this place and in Westminster, but I would like to hear what you have done in this, up in Edinburgh, in this Parliament, to address the issues. You know, we have had several months, 10 months now, since we have made a decision to come out. And I would like to think that there's been much work being done in this place to find a way forward. You know, we all recognise that there are difficulties ahead, but there are also opportunities ahead. And one of the main opportunities is to design a system more suited to Scottish agriculture than what we've had to live with the CAP in the past. And I'm hearing nothing that's been done in this place to try and address the issues going forward.
Correct. There's numerous things that we've done. by myself and my predecessor. For example, the vision document which set out the future of Scottish farming was brought forward in June last year or thereabouts. We've also appointed 4 champions: Henry Graham, Archie Gibson, Marion McCormick and John Kinnaird. They're working very hard in important areas of education, food and drink, public value and sustainability. We've appointed the Russell Griggs Group to look forward to identify ways in which we can have sustainable, profitable farming, but also respecting the environment. But let me go back to the initial premise of the question, Convener. Mr. Chapman asked me, you've made much about the negotiations with Westminster. There actually haven't been any negotiations. Negotiations is when you have a discussion, starting off with an offer, a counter-proposal, a dialogue, a commercial agreement. I've spent a lot of my life in business doing that. There has been no negotiation because the UK government haven't been willing to enter into any negotiations on convergence. So I don't actually, with respect, Convener, I'll just finish on this point, accept the premise of the question.
Mr. Ewing, sorry. I think the question was trying to identify the areas, my understanding, and certainly the understanding of the question from Rhoda was what areas of the current system that you would like to keep and take forward in the future for agriculture. And I think that's what farmers and what this committee are looking for you to give an answer on. So rather than making a critique, I think are there some areas that you could give us that we should be looking at as the future for farming post-2020 as far as subsidies is concerned?
Well, I think Mr. Chapman asked what work we were doing, so I've just described some of the work that we're doing, the vision document, and I will share that with you, although it's in the public domain, Convener, if you haven't seen it. We've appointed 4 champions who are looking specifically at key areas, and these 4 champions are very respected leaders and experts in rural life. That's why we chose them. I think it's very important to use the experience and the willing assistance and aid of experts out with this place. That's why Henry Graham, the National Chair of Lantra, Archie Gibson, the Chair of the Scottish Food and Drink Federation, Marion McCormick, the Buying Director of Aldi's, and John Kinnaird, the former President of the NFU and Chair of the Royal Scottish Agricultural Benevolent Institution. I mean, what better way to shape future ideas and thinking and policy than to engage and involve the farming community, leading rural representatives. So that's what we're doing. We also, Convener, held various events. I've held various summits on rural life, 2 on forestry, 1 on shellfish, 1 on procurement, 1 on farming and food, 1 on food and drink. We have also held discussion groups, and so has Rosanna Cunning, with NGOs and with representatives of the farming and rural communities in Scotland. And therefore, we have been involved in a huge amount of work. We're also, and Mr. Rumbles, I expect, will raise this, have agreed to Parliament that we should form a group of experts, and we're close to coming to a decision on that in the next few weeks. But there is a final point I'd make, and that is this, that if you're running a business, Convener, as you have done, as I have done, you need a budget. If you don't have a budget, you can't really run a business. You can't make a plan. And at the moment, because, as I intimated in my opening remarks, there are questions but no answers from the UK government about funding, which is a reserved UK government issue, then it is not possible for us to come up with a detailed plan about what might replace the CAP and the Pillar 2, the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 funding. And I hope that that's a fairly obvious, sensible point that everyone will accept.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate you pointing out that I know the importance of a budget, and I also appreciate the importance of cash flow on time. Now, I'm going to take Mike in on this, on the future of agricultural policy, because I think he wants to develop that theme a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Convener. And Cabinet Minister is absolutely correct. Back in January, in a full debate in the Chamber, the Cabinet Minister accepted an amendment to establish a review group to develop options for agricultural support beyond 2020, and that's what we're particularly interested in the committee post-2020. What is the Scottish Government's policy agenda for this, if it has a free hand to develop a bespoke policy for Scotland? And in an answer on the 29th of March to me, Fergus Ewing said, the Scottish Government is currently working up proposals for an external group to provide advice on future agricultural support to fit in with the expertise that the Minister's just mentioned from Archie Gibson, Henry Graham, John Kinnaird and Marion McCormick. So basically my question is, I understand entirely the point the Minister's making about which comes first, the budget or the policy development that you want to see for Scotland. So really what I'm trying to say is, if we can park, I know we don't want to do this, if we can park the money side for a moment, because we, as the Minister said, we just don't know what's going to happen there. Can we just focus on what the Cabinet Secretary thinks are his priorities for developing agricultural policy, a bespoke policy for Scotland, and how he's getting on with, you just said, hopefully in a few weeks' time, is he working to get this group of experts together, and how that is coming along? So basically, it's the policy agenda for the future rather than the money.
Well, I mean, that's a very fair question, and I think Mr. Rumbles is right in this formulation. And there are kind of three broad groups that I feel can play an important part. I've mentioned the champions. I've mentioned the Russell Griggs group, and that group will play, an extremely important role. And third grouping is a group of experts on farming and indeed the rural economy, and that is required in order to provide us with advice. But I think it is very, very easy actually to enunciate a set of principles around which I hope we could all agree that Scottish agriculture is more heavily reliant than the rest of the UK on CAP. I think by the extent of 100%, in other words, it's twice as important, to put it very simply, than for the UK pro rata. That funding is hugely important. 16% of CAP, or thereabouts, comes to Scotland. On Barnetized formula, that would be 8% or 9%. So there are high stakes here, and the funding, I think the funding is something that we can't overlook. I mean, we could park the car, but we do need the car to get to the office. However, addressing the rest of the question and moving on from that, we do need particular support schemes, as I've said, for hill farming and for the livestock sector, specifically beef and sheep production. I mean, I'm really proud of the high quality beef and lamb, and the farmers do a terrific job producing high quality products. Quality Meat Scotland do a great job in marketing, but the financial support of some sort does need to be there to continue that. Otherwise, imports, perhaps with no tariff barriers from New Zealand, from Argentina, will simply swamp the market and render our products potentially uncompetitive. So we can't ignore the importance of markets, access to single market, and the potential of tariffs, which really, for all our food produce, could have very, very serious consequences, and we can't ignore that. We also recognise that CAP funding is vital for the Scottish forestry sector, especially the grants for new woodland creation, but also woodland management and research, an area where we work closely with the UK, for example. And CAP is also the primary vehicle for agri-environment schemes, and a replacement for that would be essential in the event of Brexit. So we are working hard on this. We have more work to do. We have been seeking a better deal within CAP for new entrants, given the average age of farmer, I think, is just south of 60, which is not a very good statistic. So there are lots of policy objectives and imperatives that I hope we can all agree should be part of a new policy. But to formulate precise policy, I think, does require more detail on money, on markets, on labour, and sadly we don't have that at the moment. The last thing I'd say, and this is important, I entirely agree with Commissioner Hogan that the current CAP scheme has a penalty regime which often, sadly, results in very serious consequences for farmers and crofters for relatively minor clerical or inadvertent errors in the completion of the agricultural forms. And many of us who've been around this place for a long time have had tragic cases of very often elderly farmers making a simple mistake in a form leading to a loss of income, sometimes their whole year's income for a clerical error. Now, Commissioner Hogan, convener, I'm sure you know, is working on reforming that, and that is good. But I would certainly recommend that in the event of a new policy being required, if Brexit were to go ahead, then we would have to have a regime which treats people fairly and doesn't punish them for clerical mistakes.
Okay, I want to bring in Mike Russell, if I may, and then I'll come back to you, Mike, and then Peter, and then back to Rhoda, if I may. So, Mike,
I just wanted to make one point, convener, about the context of this. Fergus is absolutely right to say that the development of the policy will be undertaken, of course, by him and by people who work with him. But where the negotiation is far distant from that moment. And it's very important that people realise where this actually is. There are probably 4 possible outcomes. One is a continuation of devolved policy making as exists now, building to a fully independent policy. Another one is a transition process, which could be of any length and time. Another one is the development of a UK framework anticipated in the White Paper and in the Prime Minister's Mansion House speech. But whether that is a framework in which decisions are made by the United Kingdom or whether there's an element of co-decision, as in Europe at the moment, we do not know what the preference would be on that. In addition, and this is like playing three-dimensional chess inside a Rubik's Cube, because then you've got the issues of freedom of movement, whether there will be a continuing flow of labour or not, whether leaving it on WTO terms would be very harmful to agriculture. So it is possible to have a blue sky vision of a policy, but the ways in which this can be and is likely to be constrained are many and varied. And the UK government has not yet brought to the table a single proposal that actually outlines these. And indeed, from the discussions that we've had, it is unlikely that that will be part of the discussion, possibly even in this calendar year, given the nature of the negotiations that were about to start and now will be delayed by at least another month to 6 weeks.
Mike,
particularly helpful. I mean, this is the nub of what I'm trying to get at. If we are assuming, and perhaps you could correct me if I'm wrong, but we're assuming the government's preferred option would be to maintain the 17% level of the 17% of UK farm support that we get. So if it is the preferred option that we keep the 17% there, we then should have a plan, should we not, of how best we want a bespoke system in Scotland. I'm assuming that is what the Scottish Government wants, but I've not heard that. It would be very helpful if the committee heard that, to say that that's particularly what the Scottish Government's preferred scheme would be.
Could I just make a point about this? I think I don't have any great differences. I don't think the Cabinet Secretary's great differences what Mike Rumbles is saying. But the constraints upon that preferred scheme are so great that it's not possible. Fergus has outlined the principles, and that's very important, some of the people playing a role in that. But the moment you introduce, for example, the issue of freedom of movement, you have a whole enormous issue which will influence very greatly some of the issues in there. Money is also crucial. So accepting that it's not in your gift, Mr. Rumbles, but where the 17% in your gift, that would be a good start. But of course, there is no such commitment, and the history of negotiation in taking devolved powers, money for devolved powers, and having that money devolved has always been the Treasury tries to deliver less than the policy costs. That has been the experience. It is the experience of Social Security at the moment.
If I may, I'm not trying to be critical here, but have a proactive approach rather than
I think the Cabinet Secretary has indicated that proactive approach. I'm simply being boringly pedantic in terms of saying there are such a huge range of qualifications that has to be borne in mind as well.
just before we bring in, I'd like to try and bring in Peter, because I think his question's linked to that, and maybe you could answer the two at the same time.
Well, I understand the constraints. There has to be negotiations have to take place. But that doesn't stop the two ministers who are sitting here today in front of us to convey to us what they would like to see Scottish agriculture look like in the future. I'm hearing no vision about how we should look at the future of Scottish agriculture. No, I'm not hearing a vision about how we should be looking at Scottish agriculture. You've told me what's going on behind the scenes, but surely you can illustrate some of the pluses that could come out of this Brexit negotiation, rather than telling us all the negative stuff. And that's all we've heard. It's all been negative, negative, negative. There are opportunities here. Let's hear what they are.
Okay.
Vital point.
Yeah, I mean, if I may,
positives.
I certainly will let you make it briefly, but I feel that Fergus should come in after you. So just very briefly.
Can I just make the point about the positives? I'd be happy to hear those positives from Mr. Chapman or anybody else, and I've been open to do so. I have to say my inbox is not full of people who have positives, because every time they come with a positive, it is possible to show, far from being a positive, it turns out to be a poisoned chalice. But if he has positives, I'm happy to hear them.
Fergus, would you like to come back on both those?
Well, I'll certainly try to do so. Firstly, Mr. Chapman's point, I don't think it was a question really, but I think I have outlined that I passionately believe that Scottish farming produces high quality food, and also that our farmers and our crofters are those who have shaped and sculpted the landscape for generations, and that allows us to be attractive as a country for visitors. It allows us to have some of the most beautiful scenery in the world. It hasn't happened by accident. It's because of the work they do. That should continue. That is, I think, a vision that I have. It's to use our natural assets to their best advantage, protecting the crown jewels and having a thriving, vibrant rural economy. That, I think, is a vision. It is to me, at any rate. It's for others to judge whether that vision is one that Scotland should follow. Regarding Mr. Rumble's point, I take the view that if the UK government were to confirm that the funding that comes to Scotland, that has come to Scotland, that I outlined in my opening statement of €4.6 billion over 14 to 20, were to be matched and replicated for the further period of, say, 5 years, that would allow us then to have some serious planning and discussion. In other words, my challenge to you and my request and my ask tomorrow to the UK government will please confirm that you will at least match the funding from Europe. After all, that's what Andrea Leadsom and George Eustace said prior to the Brexit vote. And in fact, and you know, I've got respect for the work Mr. Eustace has done in some areas and get on perfectly well with him on a personal basis and with Ms. Leadsom. But he did say that the funding will be at least matched, and then he added, without a shadow of a doubt. Now, all I'm asking, Convener, is that the UK government do, after Brexit, what they promised to do before the Brexit vote.
I'm sure they'll hear your message loud and clear tomorrow. I'd like to, and probably listening to this committee, Rhoda, if you'd like to come in on that.
I think there's two issues, and both have gone into the issues about negotiations with the UK government, but I think we're keen to see what the Scottish government are doing going forward. And you have outlined some of that. I think my concern is that how, you know, there's experts and specialists all being set up. What about, I mean, we all know that farming and crofting involves very small businesses, people who don't engage with conferences and the like. How is the Scottish government going out to them and learning from them what they require from a scheme going forward?
I think we do so in a number of ways, reaching out to engage with small business and across the whole portfolios, obviously. I mean, the small business bonus provides the most generous rates relief in the UK, and over 100,000 businesses receive it and pay no or low business rates. And having run a small business, that financial assistance is probably the most concrete and most advantageous of any measure I can think to assist small business in the UK. But on specifically in relation to rural economy, we haven't touched on the digital process, but we are, even although digital under Chapter C of Schedule 5 of the Scotland Act is plainly a reserve function, we couldn't hang around for the UK government to invest, so we came up with a £400 million 2 contracts in order to invest in broadband to help small businesses.
Sorry, Mr. Ying, sorry.
Yes.
I don't mean to be difficult, but there are a lot of themes that we want to develop, and broadband wasn't specifically recognised, and people realise that the government has made a commitment to broadband, and I'm sure appreciative when it's delivered. So if I could ask you to stick specifically to that, and I know your colleague Mike wants to come in on the back of what you're saying, so perhaps if you could just tighten the answer, and then I'll come to Mike.
Well, I think the question was quite an omnibus question. It was what could we be doing to help small business in rural Scotland? And I can tell you, Convener, I get emails almost every day about this, so I didn't want to omit to
just to come back
sorry,
to answer that, but I'm happy to hear a further word.
I've obviously not been clear. What I'm saying is farmers and crofters are small businesses. They don't engage in conferences and with expert working groups and the like. How are you reaching out to them, crofters and farmers, especially the small ones that do the hill farming? How are you reaching out to them to get them involved in formulating the policy for intervention going forward?
Okay, again, by a variety of ways, and working with MPs and MSPs who are reaching out to them all, and then engaging with myself. I mean, I met Mr. Carson yesterday about a fishing interest, for example. So we do work to some extent as a team, I suppose. But to answer the question specifically, let me just give you some specific examples of how I have reached out to the smaller crofter farmer. I attended, as did Mr. Russell, I think, in different days, in Applecross, the Scottish Crofting Federation annual conference, and a very good event it was too. I think there was a Q&A session that lasted for about an hour, and it was very positive. I think 3 weeks ago I attended a hill farming summit with my colleague Aileen Campbell in Lanark. Almost all of the attendees were small farmers, individual hill farmers, almost all, and also some in the supply business of fertiliser, contracting, fencing. Later, in a month or so, I shall be holding a second hill farming summit in Dingwall after the lambing season is over, and we'll be engaging with them. Also, it's important that I should credit the role of the local ARPID offices throughout the country, 17, I think, in total, Mr. Barnes will correct me if I'm wrong, who are day and daily engaging, communicating with farmers and crofters. Much of that is fed back, Convener, to me, because I'm in regular contact with the local offices, and indeed I've visited over half of them. So, you know, I think Ms Grant has raised a very important point, and indeed if there are other ways in which she or members think that the government should reach out and work with the small business unit in the farming and crofting world as a result of this meeting, I would gladly consider any such recommendation.
Thank you. And Mike, can I ask you to come in briefly? I'd just remind everyone that so far we've dealt with 3 themes, and we're 45 minutes into the session. We've got another 8 to go. So brief answers, brief questions would be appreciated so we can get through all the business. Mike.
I just wanted to point out in relation to that question, one of the roles I have is to work with my colleagues to meet with range of people right across Scotland. I take it very seriously. I accompanied Fergus to a number of those meetings. I've also held events and meetings myself. I also take it very seriously within my own constituency. I tend to take the Miss Marple approach, that if you know what's happening in your own patch, then you can understand things more widely. As a result of which, I've held regular meetings. Indeed, Fergus has been with me on Isla. At the meeting, I've held meetings right across Argyll and Bute to understand what is happening there and what people want, and in addition, what also people might want from a new system of agricultural support, which tends out to look rather like the existing system of agricultural support, I have to say, but there we are.
I'm going to move on to the next theme. John, to you.
And morning, panel. It's been briefly touched on by the Cabinet Secretary, and this theme's about regulation and standards, and I'll maybe just roll a number of questions into one there, please. Our crofting and farmers are subject to EU legislation and regulation, and indeed some international regulation, and there's differing views on the significance of that legislation. It wouldn't surprise anyone that I would align myself with Mr. Ritchie of Scottish Environment Link when he says better regulation drives efficiency. We do not believe that regulation equals red tape, quite the contrary. But Cabinet Secretary, you touched on earlier a more humane regime of regulation. Can you outline how that would dovetail with maintaining the high standards that I presume that we would all want to see in the agriculture and food sector, and how it would be used to monitor and enforce standards to demonstrate to the market the high quality products that Scotland produces?
Yes, thank you. I think Mr. Finney sets out the case very well, that high standards do remain vital if we are to compete in home and international markets. And one of the things that I found from engagement with leading figures in the farming community was just how important these high standards are as a means of continuing to rely on access to markets. For example, producers, the provenance of our seed potatoes is dependent upon compliance with regulations of a very high standard to counteract the risk of disease, for example. And therefore, only by meeting those high EU standards are our seed potatoes able to access markets first of the EU. In other words, compliance with standards is a sort of entry card to markets, and it's also a barrier. If you don't have them, you're barred from markets. And therefore, you know, appropriate regulation shouldn't be seen as a foe, but a friend, an enabler. And indeed, were we to go down the route of you know, some ultra-Brexiteers that get rid of all the red tape, then there wouldn't be many friends in the farming world who rely on high market equally with our quality beef and sheep and our regulation of our abattoirs. I mean, these are very, very high standards, and rightly so. And were we to depart from that in a sort of free market way, then I think that the commercial results would be devastatingly bad. And high standards do need regulatory frameworks, animal health and welfare, as Mr. Finney well knows, as well as protection against disease. And we don't have to think back too far to remember the ravages caused to communities, individuals, as well as economic cost by foot and mouth. So the best outcome would be to continue to remain a member of the EU. And were that to be the case, then these high standards would be a given.
Yes, I accept your final comment. Indeed, it would be my party's position. But were the UK to come out of the EU, do I understand you to say that to continue training would need to maintain these standards, indeed others as well, Cabinet Secretary? So there is a view that this provides an opportunity to burn a lot of regulatory information, and we move on to a bright new future. That's not how you see it?
Well, I think there's an opportunity to get rid of some of the kind of what's often termed and described by farmers as gold plating. In other words, an overzealous interpretation of the rules. And that's one of the reasons why Professor Griggs is looking with a group which includes farmers and NGOs and a wide variety of experts on this important issue, so that we get a Scottish approach that ensures profitability but also environmental sustainability.
In relation to that, then, if it's a prerequisite to trade with the EU, has there been any discussions, or will there be any contact between Professor Briggs and the EU on the work stream they're undertaking?
Yes, there will be. And it's also one of the questions that I asked but have not yet obtained an answer from Ms Leadsom was, if in the event of Brexit, the UK would be a foreign country to the EU, a third country. That then means that there would be, on paper, the requirement of inspection points on the EU mainland, and therefore any export of food or fish produce would have to be checked at inspection points. Quite how many points it would have to be, who would pay for them, who would run them, what delay, what costs would arise to exporters. These are all questions that we've asked, but sadly we have not had answers from the UK government, and these are all regulatory matters too.
The issue of regulation is a concerning one, because the assumption made that there are a vast number of regulations that can simply be abandoned is an unsafe assumption, largely because safety drives many of the regulatory regimes. But there's another issue in here which needs to be understood. There will essentially be, in many things, two big blocks of regulation, US and EU. And if you're not in either of those, then for many global manufacturers and for many global traders, you go down the pecking order, because they're not going to spend a lot of time and effort trying to please a much smaller regulatory system until they have already pleased the two big regulatory systems. So far from it being something that frees up to allow people to be more active, sometimes, for example, in pharmaceuticals, the opposite will be the case, that the priority of your market will decline if you're not in either of those blocks. So that is actually a big worry for many people. And Fergus is absolutely right in terms of trading. If you cannot meet the requirements laid down, for example, by the EU, you will not be able to trade within that block. So there are huge difficulties in simply saying, let's have a bonfire of regulation. That which is safety-based is there for a purpose. That which is there for other reasons and is part of the block, if you don't observe it, you don't get in.
Thank you. If we can move on to the next theme, which is Gail is going to introduce.
Good morning. It's about integrated land use policy. We spoke about it in the last session that we had, and Stuart Goodall from COMFOR is putting forward a suggestion about a countryside policy rather than a common agricultural policy. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, we are very much attuned to the proposal that there should be a sort of integrated land use policy reflecting that rural Scotland's economy comprises a range of activities, not only farming being the lead, but also forestry and fishing, and also field sports and as you know, convener fishing, angling. So it encompasses a comprehensive range, and we did publish a land use strategy in 2011. The latest version of our strategy does cover a period from 16 to 21 and aims to encourage an integrated approach to land use. I think that there is a desire among stakeholders to build on this work. For example, one practical piece of work that we are doing at the moment is to encourage more work between farming and forestry, sheep and trees project, and I'm due to meet the NSA to discuss this further. And whereas in the past, I think perhaps there has been a view among some hill farmers that forestry is seen as a bit of a challenge, something that's seen as a competition, that increasingly, rather than an either-or approach, the two are seen as cumulative, that a large hill farm could sustain a plantation on part of the land, and indeed the Forestry Commission are doing excellent work to encourage some farmers to think about plantation. So an integrated approach is very sensible. It's been part of the approach the Scottish Government has taken for many years, and we have, I will actually be meeting with COMFOR this evening and some of their members where we may discuss this further.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to move on now from agriculture to more questions on fisheries. And John, you're going to start us off on that, please.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I mean, the common fisheries policy seems to be loved and loathed in different circles. We've had it suggested by some people that there's nothing good in the common fisheries policy and it should just be walked away from. But, I mean, it does seem also that it has been contributed to the fact we actually still do have fish in the sea and they haven't all been taken away. So can you give us any outline as to what parts of the common fisheries policy you feel we should keep and carry on with, and which parts we can walk away from?
Well, the common fisheries policy has caused enormous problems for Scottish fishermen, and they have been compounded by the fact that we believe profoundly that Scotland not having a direct voice in the EU has hindered our ability to prevent the worst excesses of the CFP over the decades. That said, there are aspects of the CFP which it would be sensible to retain. For example, the types and specifications of fishing gear that may be used and which are subject of regulation, and there's a role for that. But at a higher level, there's a guiding principle that fisheries should be sustainable and that there should not be overfishing, and if there is overfishing, then of course everybody is the loser. So sustainability requires there to be a system of setting of quotas in line, Convener, with scientific advice. And the relatively brief period I have been Cabinet Secretary, engaging with Mr Gibb in particular, but also with Scottish Fishermen's Federation, inshore fisheries groups, and a whole range of stakeholders in fishing, is that there is an acceptance that scientific advice has a role to play. I think maybe some time ago there would be a huge scepticism about the advice, but I think now there's a better alignment between the scientists and the fishermen, and a realization that they need to work together. So I think there are some things that we would wish to retain. The other thing we'd wish to retain, of course, is access to markets, and the EU is a hugely important market for our fish, massively important, particularly I think to Shetland actually. as I learned in my recent visit there. And also the ability of people from the EU to work in our fish processing factories. I mean, many of them that I've visited are pretty much dependent on EU people who've come from EU countries, many of whom may now be living in Scotland, but many of whom feel a wee bit uncertain about whether they will have a long-term future here. The last point I'd make, Convener, at a high level is that the EU has been the supplier of a great deal of financial assistance in order to, if you like, build the capacity of our fishing effort, and the financial aid under the MFF and other sources to ports and harbours, to upgrading the facilities at our ports and harbours, Peterhead and Fraserburgh, and around the country really, as well as to processors and others and individual businesses, has been immensely important. Over £77 million was provided under the European funding scheme to over 1,200 projects in the fishing, processing and aquaculture sectors, safeguarding around 8,000 jobs. So there is a question about what would replace that source of funding, which is not as well known as the CFP, but nonetheless plays a hugely important role, as I've seen from visits around our ports and harbours in particular.
Okay, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned markets, and I was particularly interested in that because we did have evidence from some of the fishing groups, and I think especially at the high end of the market, that they're not so worried about a few pence or pounds on as a tariff. They're more worried about getting the fish through the borders quite quickly, and if there's delays in getting fish into France or Spain or wherever it might be, that would be the big worry for them. I mean, can you give us any reassurance? Is that a priority for you in negotiations?
Well, it's certainly something I'll be raising tomorrow at my meeting with Mr Eustace, and just to give you an idea of the figures, I mean, the seafood exports are worth 601 million and account for 78% of seafood exports in 16. And the EU market, the single market, access to that market is hugely important. And were there to be delays at inspection points or whatever they may be called, then particularly for fish, any time period delay would be a big disadvantage and a serious place in jeopardy continued access to those markets simply on practical grounds.
Do anything about that? Sorry.
John, but before you do, sorry, I was going to bring in Mike there because he'd indicated he wanted to come in. So, Mike, if you come in and then I'll let John.
Yeah, I was going to say that this is an issue that concerns bodies such as the Chamber of Shipping, the British Ports Association, whom I've met with in that role I was referring to in meeting wide range of organisations. Perishable goods, and particularly fish, are probably at most risk, but so is the issue of just-in-time manufacturing. I have to say at the present moment there is no clarity about how that system will be dealt with in terms of tariffs. We have, of course, no tariff barriers at the moment. The moment you put tariffs in, of any description, then you require inspection of or declaration of goods. If that takes place, then there are issues in terms of delay. There are issues also in terms of piling up lorries. You're familiar with the images of the motorway in Kent with lorries all the way down it. That is because there is no sizable marshalling area now in any of the major ports that can deal with tariff goods in that way. So there are considerable issues to be addressed and not much time to address them. This is one of the big issues for transition. It would not be possible to put in that type of system after 2 years. You would require 5 to 10 years to be able to develop that system.
John, do you want to come back? Can I just ask, is that part of John's question was the things that you'd like to keep? Could you give me one, just for my information, one item that you would like to lose that's part of the common fisheries policy at the moment?
Well, I think the most problematic area of the CFP at the moment is the way in which the landing obligation is being implemented. And obviously the purpose is to prevent discards, to prevent throwing fish over the side of boats, and that's a repellent practice, and everybody agreed that it should come to an end. But in order to deliver a practicable result, there has to be a system that does not result in fishing vessels having to be tied up in February. I mean, you wouldn't expect Marks and Spencer's to shut in February a year, would you, and then remain shut for the rest of the year. So the this matter, I think, is an area where I felt a greater flexibility is required and is the subject of ongoing discussion in the EU Commission. And I think I was in attendance at the EU Commission discussions in November, and then, of course, with Mr Gibb in the December negotiations. And I think we achieved a remarkable outcome in those negotiations, not least because of the expertise and experience of Mr Gibb and his colleagues and the respect with which they're held in their peers in Europe. But we are up against a stumbling block of a regulation, I think, Convener, that was overly prescriptive, and I think many fishermen would be happy to see that go or be changed into a more manageable. But it's a problem that has to be dealt with, though, because nobody wants to see a recurrence of the practices we've seen in the past of dumping good fish over the side, being entirely wasted. So it's not an easy problem, but I think there needs to be far more flexibility in finding a solution to it.
Peter, you've got a...
Just on that very point, would it be worth considering that changing from a quota system to a days at sea system to regulate the fishing, you know, the amount of fish taken, go down a different route entirely?
Well, I think that some system of ensuring that fishing stocks are not overfished and exhausted is the principal key. I mean, I'm no expert in how that's achieved. There are different schools and different strategies that can be pursued. I don't know if Mr Gibb would be able to provide, since he's here and he knows far more about these things than me. I'm sure he could give a more rounded answer if he has the opportunity, Convener.
Yeah, very short. Thank you. Yes, it's quite popular in the press at the moment, the days at sea option. It's an option. There are other options such as credits for the type of fish and extra credits if you catch a cetacean and as a bycatch. What I would just emphasise is that they're very complicated. In the mixed fishes of the North Sea, for example, you have to look at your weakest stock if you're going to follow your international responsibilities around sustainability. You can't just go out and have an unlimited fishing, unlimited number of days or a fixed number of days, because you have to understand the mixture of your catch and avoidance techniques. So a days at sea only solution is unlikely to fit the mixed fisheries that we have in the North Sea and the west of Scotland.
Okay, thank you. The next area we'd like to look at, Stuart's going to lead us on.
Thank you very much, Convener. I want to talk about two issues related to the exclusive economic zone, access for our vessels to the waters to 200 miles, and indeed enforcement of our rights in these waters. Committee has heard both at the SPICE breakfast meeting and in our own deliberations that we have the right to arrogate to ourselves the waters out to 200 miles, although we might choose not to do so. Interestingly, it's not a new issue, and I actually discovered old SNP policy papers from 1974, which talk about the issue. The bottom line is, does the Cabinet, either Cabinet Secretary or Minister, are they able to tell us whether, in the light of what the UK has said in its white paper, where it's in mutually beneficial result for fishermen in the EU and the UK, what they understand from that? Have there been any indications of what they understand from that? And how does that support the SFF's position, which I support, that we must first have exclusive control before negotiating how we use that exclusive control?
Significantly, the Prime Minister's Lancaster House speech and the White Paper both referred to fisheries only in these terms, and only in terms of essentially trading away access to waters. Now, this is, I think, for many eerily familiar of what took place in the 1970s during accession. And certainly I have heard nothing different from that in the negotiation discussion to date. Fisheries has been referred to in the JMC process, not as a specific subject, but as an illustration of subjects that will require to be dealt with in the detail of the European negotiations, but on the basis of recognising, for example, historic rights that exist elsewhere, and that was also subject of some media coverage yesterday. So if I were a member of the SFF, I would not be confident that the UK government is either listening to or has heard the points that have been made.
To come back on that.
Yes, just briefly, Mr Stevenson has raised this matter before here and in the Chamber of Parliament, and I have raised this question on several occasions, both with George Eustace and with Andrea Leadsom, and the specific question I have asked is for a guarantee that the UK government will not bargain away Scotland's fishing interests in its Brexit negotiations. I have received no answer to that question.
The second part of my question, because I think that's quite clear where we stand, if not where others stand, is enforcement, and working on the basis that we have responsibility for how fishing is conducted out to the 200-mile limit. What challenges are there in getting that new responsibility that we might have to respond to?
I think questions about enforcement involve technical aspects. I'd be very grateful if Mr Gibb would be able to assist the committee.
Yeah, thank you. We currently, under the devolved fisheries management arrangements, already monitor the Scottish fishing zone out to 200 miles. So our Marine Scotland patrol vessels and Marine Scotland patrol aircraft are already very active, monitoring not only Scottish and UK vessels, but 11 non-Scottish nationalities that fish in the Scottish zone currently. So we're well versed in that. The enforcement burden will increase because you would need to make sure that people who had access to our waters had that access legitimately negotiated, so there would be an increased burden of that. I think there is no doubt. I think it would be also fair to say that we would be relying on vessel monitoring satellite systems and electronic logbooks, which are actually two additional elements of the current CFP that we would probably look to keep very technical. But that allows for collective and remote monitoring of activity in your waters and in other member states' waters as well.
Thank you. John, you've now got some questions on a slightly different area.
Yeah, it's on this theme is about ecosystems approach to fisheries management, and in part it's been touched on, I think, by yourself, Cabinet Secretary. Just as there's been calls for an integrated rural or countryside policy, we heard in a previous meeting from Callum Duncan of the Marine Conservation Society calling for effectively the retention of a regionalised ecosystem approach to the management of fisheries. And that, there's a lot of background to it, I'll be brief, and that includes the protection of crucial fish habitats, for example, breeding and spawning grounds. How do you respond to calls for a sustainable ecosystem-based approach linking fisheries to marine protection areas and special areas of conservation? And would Brexit facilitate that more readily, or what impact would future arrangements have on the ability to have that system?
Well, we have, Convener, adopted the Scottish National Marine Plan in 2015, which promotes the kind of approach that Mr Finney is raising here, putting the marine environment at the heart of the planning process. And I share responsibilities on these issues with Rosanna Cunningham and, of course, Marine Scotland are to the fore in taking this work forward. So a sustainable ecosystem-based approach to fisheries management should be taken in accordance with these principles. And I think, Convener, also it's seen as an asset by many of sectors of our fishing, for example, shellfish, as sectors reliant on the image that we have and the reality that we have a clean marine environment from which our high-quality shellfish products enjoy a provenance and a receptability in the marketplace. So we are taking this approach at the moment. The second question was, how would Brexit allow improvements in this area? I think the only difference Brexit would make is to change the process for offshore fisheries measures from an EU member state negotiation process to a national legislative one. And I think that, broadly speaking, the impression I get is the EU is in favour of the ecosystem approach, and indeed much of the environmental legislation is EU legislation.
John, do you want to come back?
No, I think leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you to that. Fulton, you're now going to ask about the next subject.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. It's an issue that both Mike and Fergus have already raised, but how does the Scottish Government respond to some of the stakeholders' concerns that this committee has heard about the possible restrictions of EU labour in these sectors? And what would be the Scottish Government's response to deal with this? Perhaps just to combine and make it one question, you know, in the interest of time, and specifically in areas such as vets and research. Thanks.
Yes.
If I could ask you, I mean, it's a huge subject, I understand that, but if you could keep it as tight
as brief as possible. We did lay out in Scotland's Place in Europe our proposals with regard to freedom of movement, specifically to the 4 freedoms, but of which freedom of movement is one of the more important ones for Scotland. There are about, in the food sector, about 8,000 EU nationals employed, in about 15,000 in the non-seasonal market. There's a big dependency in agriculture on labour from the EU. 60% of the workforce in the abattoir sector comes from outside Scotland, largely from EU nationals. So there will be big pressures on the labour force, and there is no obvious place from where these people can come to be replaced. Now, that's also a pressure in the tourism sector, in the finance sector, in the innovation sector. 25% of staff in EU, in research, for example, come from other EU countries. So we are very dependent upon labour coming into Scotland. We have essentially no information from the UK government about how they would replace the present system. Rather interestingly, some of the press speculation the weekend about what was called the barista visas, that is giving young people a visa for 2 years, which was raised by, I think, the Home Secretary, which would not give young people any rights in terms of continued residence or in terms of support from the state, but would allow young people to work here for a couple of years, may be one of the solutions. And that's rather interesting, because what it tells you is there is a problem in leaving the EU, and a sticking plaster solutions will be required to solve some of those problems. Now, in Scotland, you won't be able to use a sticking plaster solution for agricultural labour and for agricultural work. If you put in place a sectoral approach, which has existed before, you will have very considerable difficulties in administering that. For example, I think this committee has heard from Angus growers about the difficulties that existed in terms of soft fruit, and the fact that the solution there may be not to do anything about labour coming from Romania and Bulgaria, but actually to move the bushes to Romania and Bulgaria and to move the entire industry out of Scotland. So the reality of this is this will be a very considerable pressure right across the Scottish economy, particularly in a rural economy, and presently there are no proposals to solve it. And it is at various levels. The issue you make of vets is very interesting. The professional level of this will probably be the hardest part to solve, because there will perhaps be some alternatives, a small number of alternatives for some labour. There won't be any for professional services. And indeed in the health service, you know, many doctors and nurses are very, very fed up with essentially being treated as bargaining counters and are already leaving. The number of nurses coming in is dropping quite dramatically. So this is a problem which we look to the UK government to say, how are you going to bring forward a solution for migration? There is presently no policy options presented, as a result of which there is no solution, and we are 2 years away from leaving. It's another area where there will also have to be some transitional arrangements, which of course is very difficult for those people who believe very strongly in Brexit, because Brexit is about controlling access. And if you are not going to do that, some might argue, what's the point?
That's a very full answer, Cabinet Secretary. Unless there's anything specific you want to add, I'd quite like to move on to the next theme, if I may.
Just a few points. That there's around 181,000 non-UK nationals living in Scotland, and rural Scotland is particularly vulnerable to the loss of any of these people who have chosen to come to Scotland. And in particular, our leading agri-food and environment research institutes in Scotland have attracted talent from many EU countries. So any threat to that would be a very serious one to the continuing success, the research excellence of our institutes.
Thank you. Jamie, can I ask you to lead off on the next one, please?
And good morning. Can I ask the ministers here today if they think that any new or enhanced trading opportunities or relationships will arise from as a result of the UK's exit of the European Union? If yes, what they think those opportunities might be or where they might lie? And if not, why not?
Mike.
I still have to see any evidence of those trading opportunities presented to me. There is sometimes much is made, for example, of India, and the fact that we might be able to sell more whiskey to India as a result of this, so it's not clear why that would be the case. In reality, of course, the Prime Minister went to India last October endeavouring to get trade deals and failed. And she failed because, by and large, the Indian government wished to establish a relationship based on migration, and particularly about younger and talented migrants who wanted to come to this country. And very often, internationally, then there is a trade-off. Migration is a trade-off for increased trade. Something has been made of the old Commonwealth countries, so in actual fact there's no evidence of that, and indeed the Australian Foreign Secretary has talked about using Ireland as a route into the single market and preferring investment in Ireland. And of course, the real example of this lies in Germany. Germany is far more successful in international trade than the UK. Germany is a full and central member of the EU and has no intention of leaving. It is not constrained in any way. So I see no evidence of constraint upon trade that membership of the EU brings. My own view is that the cost and difficulty of this process of withdrawal is far in advance of any advantage that might be seen. And I've always said if people will bring me evidence that this is greatly to our advantage, I'll be happy to look at it. So far, I think 8 months into this job, nobody's done so. But I'm always ready for it if Mr. Green has some here today.
If I may clarify, this was a question to you, not a question to myself. Do you think there are any trading opportunities outside of the EU that may arise as a result of exit to the EU?
I think I've just answered that question.
So that's a no.
The answer is no, but I'm willing, in the spirit of trying to work with people, which I believe I should do, I'm willing to hear examples if they're brought to me by anybody.
Burgess, do you want to add to that at all or not?
To help Mr. Russell to find it.
What?
Have you an example?
Well, what I was going to say was that I don't think there's any additional opportunities to those that already exist. I mean, there already are huge efforts by entrepreneurial people in our food and fish sectors to export throughout the world, and indeed they are well helped by bodies such as Scottish Development International, who have engaged the services of a number of individuals to assist the further exports. But the EU and membership of the EU is not an impediment to accessing that additional trade. It is, if anything, an advantage because it's a badge of compliance with the high standards and it's part of the European single market. So I actually find it very difficult to, I mean, you know, Mr. Green is very welcome to give us some examples to give us a little bit of help in this question here, but I'm as baffled and perplexed as Mr. Russell. On the other hand, there's nothing at all uncertain about the risks. A switch to the default WTO tariff arrangements could lead to EU tariffs averaging between 7 and 11% being imposed on Scottish shellfish, pelagic and whitefish exports, and tariffs of up to 13% being imposed on Scottish smoked salmon exports, hence the concerns of the aquaculture sector to which I alluded in my opening remarks. So the risks, I'm afraid, are all too stark and crystal clear. The opportunities opaque and as yet unidentified.
And I have to say, as Liam Fox himself has pointed out, the opportunities for world trade are presently diminishing, not increasing. And with a protectionist United States, we also have considerable difficulties there. So I have to say the outlook is not bright in that regard, but I continue to make the offer. Somebody has examples, bring them to me.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next area, which Peter's going to lead on.
This is about untangling domestic policy from EU legislation. We all know that's going to be a monumental task. And so, I mean, does the Scottish Government really have the capacity and the skills to deal with this is one part of the question. And, you know, how many statutory instruments do you estimate will need to be reviewed, amended as part of the Brexit process for agriculture and fisheries? And what processes and structures are you, as the Scottish Government, putting in place to do precisely that?
Do you want to start on that? Mike.
The Great Repeal Bill was meant to be published at the time of the Queen's speech. Now, there now won't be a Queen's speech, of course, at least there will be, but it will be at least 6 weeks later. So, and I've discussed the Great Repeal Bill in considerable detail with David Davis and with others, and my officials have been deeply engaged in it. There are a number of questions raised by the Great Repeal Bill, and I will answer Mr. Chapman's question, but let me just put it in context. There are a number of issues raised by the Great Repeal Bill. The first of which is, can this be done in Scottish terms by a series of legislative consent motions? So in other words, can the process take place at Westminster? And can we join ourselves to the process and streamline that process by means of legislative consent motions? Or would we require, given the nature of us as a legislative parliament, would we require to actually do all the separate legislative, both primary and secondary legislation? And we won't know that until we see the Great Repeal Bill, because the Great Repeal Bill itself will, we are told, take an approach which involves not simply the legislation, but also case law. Because much of the European legislation, of course, is judged in effect by the case law that takes place. So we have to see what is proposed in the Great Repeal Bill before we can answer the question of whether we bring forward legislation or whether we are able to, by a series, because the Great Repeal Bill is the first of several bills, possibly 10 or 12 bills, or whether we ourselves will have to bring forward legislation in order to cope with the change. In addition to that, if we are planning to put in place a different agricultural regime, and if agriculture is in the end fully devolved, then we would want to have a separate repeal bill for the agricultural instruments from the one that is going to exist at Westminster. So the short answer, having given you the long preamble, is that it is likely that there will be many thousand legislative instruments. We might be able to short-circuit the process by a legislative consent process, which would be far better, but it may in the end be necessary for us to bring primary and secondary legislation, which will be very complex and will take considerable time, given that the objective of the Great Repeal process is to ensure that on the day the UK leaves, there is no hiatus in law. That period has now been shortened by about 6 weeks, the available period for it, by the decision to hold an election. So actually this is going to become a difficult, complex and time-constrained process, which will occupy quite a lot of parliamentary time from about the autumn of this year onwards, not just at Westminster, where it's going to drive out most other legislation, but may well also be very prominent here.
And do you feel that there is the capacity and the skill within this organisation, within this Parliament, to do precisely the work it may be needed? We all understand it will be difficult and there's much to be done, but can we cope?
Well, we will have to cope, otherwise there will be a hiatus at the end of this process. This is not something we've volunteered for, but we will have to cope. I've had good discussions with the Faculty of Advocates, with the Law Society, with a range of others. The Lord Advocate, of course, is deeply involved, the Scottish Government Legal Services. But I don't think anyone will underestimate this. And the key information on this we do not yet have, because that key information is, and we don't, to be fair, we don't know if the UK government has it, because it is such a complex task. There was a trawl of information that took place from last October, really onwards, looking for what would have to be done. And we played our part in that trawl, and we have a very considerable amount of data as a result of that trawl. But the way in which Westminster chooses to legislate first, to kick this process off, will determine what else follows. And as we have not seen that, as we do not know that, we did get an advance copy of the white paper on the Great Repeal Bill, but it was advance copy by about 4 hours rather than several weeks or months beforehand. And it would have been helpful to try and get as early information as we can.
Thank you. I'm going to leave that subject there and now move to Gail.
Thanks. Last question. Can you set out the phases that you're planning for the coming months and year, just in broad terms, for future plans for agriculture and fisheries? And also, what is the Scottish Government doing to prepare the rural economy for the possibility of life without EU funding?
Can I lay out the phases of what we understand to be the phases of withdrawal, and then perhaps Mr. Ewing can then fit the agricultural policy changes into there?
As you have offered, Mike, yes, you may.
Thank you.
Please sit on.
That's very good of you. The Article 50 letter triggered a 2-year process, which the clock is now ticking. The response from the EU, first response, is due on the 29th of April. The second and detailed response in terms of negotiating stance from the Council is due at the end of May. This will all, of course, be subject to delays in terms of discussion because of the UK election. But the anticipated phases of negotiation are, first of all, negotiation on the cost of withdrawal, although it is now perhaps becoming clearer that that will be about a methodology of setting cost rather than cost itself, which is crucial because once the cost is known, there will be the mother and father of all rows, I'm sure, whereas setting the methodology may not declare the cost at the beginning of the process. So there's anticipated that that and the issue of EU nationals and reciprocal arrangements for UK nationals in Europe, plus one or two other technical issues, will dominate the first period of negotiation. The question is, will there be a parallel set of negotiations on the details of the trade and other issues? Now, the European Commission presently says no, that they will want to finish the first part, and only if that is finished will they move on to the second part. I think most people expect some dovetailing towards the end of the process. So that will take into the autumn, I would think, before the negotiation on substantial issues takes place. Now, that will be very much, I think, now a sectoral negotiation. If the UK had agreed to stay in the single market in some way or another, it would have been a much simpler negotiation. It would essentially have been single market minus. So the negotiation would have been about what you weren't contributing and what you weren't taking part in. Because the UK has set its face against that, because of the issues largely to do with the ECJ and not accepting judgments outside the UK, then you will have a detailed sectoral process. That is very complicated. So it has to be finished in framework terms by essentially the end of 2018 to allow a ratification process, which will involve over 30 parliaments, because there won't just be the national parliaments, some of the sub-state parliaments will have the right to do so. The only parliament doesn't appear to have the right to do so is the Scottish Parliament, but I just make that point. And at the end of that, there will then be a decision on the framework. But then, of course, putting that into effect may take several years, because there will be transitionary arrangements to be had. I would expect the agriculture and fisheries issues to be negotiated during the year to 18 months of detailed negotiation, that is from the autumn of this year till the autumn of the following year, but I wouldn't expect the final arrangements to be going into place until the transition phase, which would be from the providing the Parliament's vote for this and the European Parliament has a final say, yes or no. That would be from the spring of 19 onwards. And the question is, how long will that be? Now, that is all, I have to say, speculation. It's informed speculation, but anything could change, including any willingness by the UK not to remain within the process. That the European process would continue and come to an end, but the UK might have walked away.
Fergus, do you want to add anything very briefly to that on timescales?
Well, the question was about phases, and we are in the first phase. And the first phase is to seek clarity about funding. What the UK proposes would be the alternative to EU funding. That clarity is essential. Secondly, about powers. We need clarity that all the powers on agriculture and fishing come to this Parliament. Yep. Thirdly, we need a resolution of the convergence issue, which I've described earlier on and which I will be pressing, as I hope with the support of all members of this Parliament. Fourthly, what we just heard from Mr. Russell's enunciation, it is, seems unlikely that there will be the prospect of any deal in relation to the continuing relationship of a UK Brexit and the EU on rural matters for some considerable time to come. And therefore, it is absolutely clear that the UK government should not postpone any longer its recognition that there must be a serious transition plan laid out. I mean, plainly, it is impossible, from what we've heard, and this discussion today is illustrative of this, to devise brand new fishing and forestry and farming policies and funding programmes between now and April 2019. It is simply impossible. Anybody can understand that. And therefore, a transition plan is required, and it's also required for this vital reason, that those who are working in the rural economy need reasonable clarity about what the future will hold regarding the funding of the excellent work that they do, And the sooner the UK government come up with a proper transition plan, the sooner some form of reassurance might be able to be provided to those who are building and delivering on the rural economy across the board.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And I'd like to thank all of you, because that brings to a conclusion our session on Brexit this morning. Fergus Ewing, thank you very much. Mike Russell, David, I noticed you helping the Minister, and Alan, thank you very much for your contribution. And Jonathan, thank you also for being in attendance. I'd like to briefly suspend the meeting while we give the witnesses a chance to change. Thank you. We'd now like to move to item 4 on the agenda, which is seatbelts. I'd like to welcome Sian Gullen, the convener of the Transport, Environment and Rural Affairs Committee of the Scottish Youth Parliament, Joanna Murphy, Chair of the National Parent Forum for Scotland, and Eileen Pryor, the Executive Director of the Scottish Parent Teacher Council. We have a series of questions that members would like to ask you, and the first one is going to come from Stuart.
Thank you very much, Convener. And it's kind of a broad brush question. We've got feedback from the SPTC and from the Youth Parliament, so that's before the committee already. But in broad terms, will this bill bring any benefit to safety in school transport?
I'd like to start that off. Eileen.
Yes. Well, I think that the principle is absolutely right, that when parents send their children off to school and entrust them to the local authority is in loco parentis. If I put my children in the car, I can't take them anywhere without strapping them in. So I think it's completely unreasonable to suggest that local authorities should be in any other position. Our children should be strapped in when they are in school transport. And in fact, we've made a point in our paper that in many areas, it's actually service buses that take young people to school. So, you know, we would argue that perhaps there is an argument for extending, but certainly within school transport, yes, children should have seat belts. Yes, we should be taking coordinated measures to encourage them to do it, and I thought the evidence from the Youth Parliament was very interesting. But we do know that there are ways to influence behaviour, that there are ways to encourage young people to make safe choices, and we should be doing everything that we can to do that. So I think the fact that young people might rail against the adults who are trying to impose seatbelt wearing on them, I don't think there's any reason not to make sure there are seatbelts and to do everything we can to make them use them.
Joanna, do you want to come back and add to that? Or?
Well, you would have to hope that it will have some benefit. Obviously, there are a lot of plans already utilised within school transport, and while I do agree with Eileen on what she says, I feel that this is we're in a position now to start discussing and communicating with the young people and their parents about what's already in place and what will be coming into force with any changes, so that it's not seen as an imposition that young people will rail against, but they understand fully why they're being asked to put a seatbelt on in the back of a bus or car.
Sam, would you like to come in on that? Don't worry about pushing the buttons.
Right.
The gentleman on your left will make sure the light comes on at the critical moment.
Well, I think young people are, like you're saying, railing against all the adults that tell them to put their seatbelt on. I think it's about making sure it's working with the young people rather than just doing something to them. It's about a partnership, perhaps with like task force or something, that of young people, parents, teachers, working sort of nationally and then sort of feeding down to the local authorities. So it's done in a way that there's a national sort of minimum standard of safety for young people and an understanding across Scotland that young people sort of need to be wearing their seatbelts, and it's not the case of, oh, we're telling you to wear your seatbelt. It's the case of, well, we want you to wear your seatbelt. Can you tell us why you're not? Rather than the case of
I think in your review of responses that there was nearly 69% of people who were asked were in favour of wearing seatbelts. So it seems to be, as you say, convincing the others. Stuart, do you want to come back on that?
Probably the simple thing to ask on the back of that, and perhaps I'll direct a specific thing, if I may, to Eileen, prior and a more general to the other at the same time. I got a hint from what you were saying, Eileen, that you might be in favour of quite stringent measures to enforce. The most stringent I could think of, and you didn't say this, and I emphasise this, would be to deny transport to people who wouldn't wear seatbelts. I would imagine that would be an option, but not necessarily one you pursue. For the others, I suppose the question is a more general one, is does this whole issue generally promote an increased awareness of the need for personal safety in school transport, and that there are other more interesting and exciting ways of putting yourselves at risk in environments where the consequences may not be so severe. So perhaps starting with Brian.
I don't think that I would say I'm in favour of stringent rules. I entirely agree with the notion that actually this is something that we do with, not to. And we, you know, schools, local authorities, parents, young people need to work together on this so that it becomes something that is the norm. Just as 30 years ago, smoking was the norm, it no longer is. Just as seatbelt wearing was not the norm, well, now it is. So it will not happen quickly, but you know, it's a process by which we work together to change behaviours. You have to use a wee bit of a carrot and a wee bit of a stick to achieve that.
Would you like to come on, comment generally on that? Or?
Not really, no, just to agree.
Okay. But you don't have to comment if there's something that you want to add. I mean, feel free. Sian.
Not really.
Okay. John, should we move on to the next question with you?
I'm kind of following on from what Stuart was asking, and I mean, I'm struck by the point Ms Gullen made about, you know, let's work with and persuade people on things, and I just wonder, do we really need a bill here at all? Surely we could work with the local authorities. Most of them are already doing this. Do you think there's really a need for a bill?
Yeah, there's always a need for legislation where there is any sense of dubiety or a sense that somebody along there's a lot of different companies, a lot of different local authorities that are involved in this, and where there's that kind of ambiguity or sometimes seen as a way out, then there needs to be legislation to stop that. It is the most important thing for a parent and obviously for the young person that when they go on a bus to school, that they, in the event of an accident, they come back, they're safe. You know, and so we can't mess about with that kind of thing. And if it's not working without legislation, then there needs to be some legislation to make it work better.
Okay, just before I bring you in, Eileen, Mike wants to add something, ask something.
Very simply, just make it a requirement from local authorities in their contracts for school transport to have seatbelts fitted. Why would you need legislation?
View on whether it needs to be legislation or part of the contracting process? What would you rather see?
I hadn't thought of that. I'll tell you, you know, one of the responses that we had, because we use social media a lot to communicate with parents, and so when we talked about this bill, the most interesting response from quite a number of parents was, I thought it was already. I thought that was in place already. So parents are already under the impression that if their child goes off in a school bus, that there is a seatbelt present. And I'm not a policy person. I don't know the ins and outs of all of the legislation and so on. But to me, however we do it, whether it simply be a requirement of the contract or legislation, however we do it, we have to be certain that it's in place, that for our young people and for our families, it's in place. I'm afraid you're the folk that are going to have to tell us what's the best way to do it. But I completely get Joanna's point that sadly, we know that if there is not legislation, very often actually the game is to work to find a way around the rules. And that's in every walk of life. So it may well be that actually legislation is required.
I think, and I may have got this wrong, what the committee is gently trying to probe is that if there's a law passed to make it legal, a requirement to have seatbelts on buses, it doesn't make it a requirement for the children to wear the seatbelt. And I think what the committee is trying to understand is whether it's a requirement just to have it part of the contract, that would achieve the same thing, or whether you think and I don't want to put words into your mouth, whether we're not going far enough by seeking it to make it a legal requirement that you have to wear a seatbelt on a bus. Sian, do you want to come back on that?
I think something worth maybe to make the legislation slightly more useful than just put into a contract is making it that the young people and parents and teachers have to be consulted on how to implement the wearing of seatbelts. You can't legally require them to wear the seatbelt through the legislation that you've got, but I understand that you can legally require the local authorities to perhaps consult with young people on better ways to implement seatbelt wearing as it is, because I think from 14, if there's a seatbelt provided, you're responsible for wearing that yourself. So I think it's also making young people aware that that already is in place and that legally they have to be wearing the seatbelt if it's provided. So that's something maybe to consider putting in to make sure that schools are making the young people aware of that.
I mean, first of all, if I can answer Mike Rumble's point, I mean, I think the whole point of the legislation is to make the local authorities put it in their contract. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's the two together. But if I could switch on, I mean, I think other colleagues are going to come in about who actually wears them or not. But the other point that's been mentioned was the service buses, which is the normal buses we all use day to day and which certainly don't have seat belts on them. I mean, is there any point, do you think, doing the buses that the schools contract if we're not also got seat belts on the service buses?
Yep, I mean, we certainly made the point that in many rural areas where I live, for instance, a lot of young people get to school through an extension of the service bus. So it goes its normal route, but it also goes off on a dog leg to school. So a lot of young people from out with the town will travel to school on that service bus. And there is an argument, I think, that says if your company is providing that kind of service, then you should also be providing seat belts so that we're not basically saying your kids are safe, but your kids are dispensable. They're on a service bus. So, you know, I think as a nation, we need to be thinking about these things and about how safe our passengers are on the bus. I don't know how often any of you travel on the bus, but I tell you, there's times I wish there were seat belts on them.
I think there's a certain amount of empathy for that comment. Peter, do you want to go with the next question?
Yeah, well, I mean, thankfully, folks, there are few injuries to kids on the way to school in buses. So, given that, do you think the requirement for seat belts is the best way forward to improve safety, or is there something else that we should be looking at and thinking about? And if so, what?
Eileen, do you want to? Joanna, do you want to come back?
It was when I brought this up, this subject up with my own members of the National Parent Forum of Scotland. They started talking about a kind of code of conduct for the young people and their parents. And when you talk about withholding the service for the bus for the young people, that has been withheld from young people who persistently misbehave on the bus, and they're put off. I don't think that's not the best way to go, of course, but it does happen. And so we need to, as we're all in agreement, we need to work with the young people. We need to work with the bus companies, their parents, the schools, the communities to get this so that the young people understand the safety aspect. Why people, we're not trying to restrain their civil liberties in any way. We just want them to be safe on the journey, like you would be if you had your seatbelt on in a car.
And sorry, and just to ask on that, to follow on, when they get off the bus, is there something that we should be doing? Is there something on the alighting, you know, when they get out, crossing the roads and all that? You know, should we just be doing more than looking at, this is your chance to tell the committee that we should be looking at more than just this bill, if that's what you think? Eileen?
You know, I think you'll know of the cases that there have been of young people who've been knocked down as they've been, you know, crossing the road to get home after getting off the bus or whatever. You know, there are some big issues here. Speed is the big one, of course. And on some rural roads, again, I live in a rural area, folk use them as a racetrack. You know, if it's a straight, the foot goes down. So there's an education process, and again, it's a carrot and stick. You know, I think that there's only so much that you can do as a committee and that the government can do. And legislation around this, as I say, if I put children in a car, I need to strap them in. That's legally my responsibility. I need to ensure that my passengers are strapped in. So I don't think it's unreasonable to legally expect bus companies and drivers to ensure that young people at least have the ability to strap in, and we encourage young folk to do it.
I mean, I just make a point. I mean, I think, Joanna, you referred to it. You know, sitting in your seat with your seat belt on would be the safest option. Sitting in your seat without the seat belt would certainly be a far better option than running up and down the corridor, for example, if that was the time that the bus had the accident. So there is an issue about behaving on the bus. over and above the fact that or not that there's seatbelts in there. And you know, you did reflect on that. And I think that's one of the issues we need to think about as well.
Fulton, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a supplementary or anything, Convener. It was really just a question about and I appreciate I might have missed this from a previous committee session, but do you think that parents in general just assume that there is seatbelts on buses? Because when I actually said to some folk that I know this was going through Parliament, the amount of times people said to me, they don't have a seatbelt on school buses? And maybe not specifically people, and I know it's anecdotal, but maybe not specifically people who had kids at school or of school age, but the amount of people who just assumed that there would be seatbelts on school transport was quite striking for me, and I just wondered if that's something you've came across.
Absolutely. It was the feedback that we got, that people were taken aback that that wasn't the situation as it stands.
That's, I notice you all nodding. That's a yes. You think everyone thinks that there are seatbelts. Jeremy, do you want to come in?
It's very briefly, just to pick up on a point that Eileen made. One of the things that's come up and crops up quite a lot in this discussion is about who's responsible for ensuring that children wear seatbelts. And I use children in the loose sense because it could be younger, under 16 and over 16-year-olds. You mentioned that you think it's if I can confirm, you think that the drivers should be responsible for ensuring that seatbelts are worn. The driver, therefore, representing the bus company that has the contract with the authority. Other schools of thought are that it's up to someone at the school at either end of that process. Other people think it's the children themselves. Other people think it's the parents. It's such a perhaps controversial issue, but are there any further views on who should be responsible and therefore legally liable if something happened if seatbelts are not worn? Because it's quite a contentious issue.
Eileen, would you like to lead on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is contentious. And I can completely see where the different perspectives come from. I think that young people's behaviour is influenced by all of these parties. My sense is that younger children will respond to an adult telling them what to do, and will generally respond favourably and do what they're required to do. Your challenge comes in teenage years as young people are expressing themselves and getting a sense of self, and particularly with that group, you're then into the territory of peer influence and modifying behaviour through consultation and discussion and setting good example. So I'm trying to get out of answering your question because I think it's really hard.
I suspect in a minute you're going to get a second bite to answer that question because John's going to come back along the lines of that, I think. And it may be appropriate to bring you in now, John, just on...
Thank you. Good morning, panel, and thanks for your input. This is a lawmaking forum, and we're keen to make good law. And I just wonder, I would seek your views on whether you feel, were this legislation to proceed, that it would be compromised if children chose not to use seatbelts.
That's a really difficult question. Joanna, do you want to go on that?
I suppose it's back down to, I suppose, who's the enforcement. Everything will be compromised if you chose not to do it. But it's back down to discussions within the school, at whatever level. I remember as a girl, all the Green Cross Code and all the adverts in the telly and the squirrel thing and all the rest of it are helping you to learn. Now, I had already walked about crossroads with my parents and they helped me to learn the dangers back in a time where there was much less traffic. So it's back to education to the young people so that they understand, and it's back to realising why they wear a seatbelt, why we wear seatbelts in cars, and sometimes just expressing some of the particularly as they get older, when they can, you wouldn't want to be showing them any kind of videos or anything like that when they were wee of things that happened. But when they get older, if they're choosing to not do something, then sometimes they have to see part of the consequences. And perhaps talking to people that have been in accidents, or there's some kind of way that the Scottish Government can put out, you know, information to the young people at schools, through their parents, at school level, through their parent councils, and through the pupil voice of the school. Then maybe that's ways of again, kind of combating and targeting the peer pressure that kids have about everything nowadays, but trying to work with them and treat them, particularly at the older ages, you know, from, you know, the secondary school age, to try and work with them so that, again, they fully understand. They don't, because it's without most people's scope to know what it's like to be in an accident. Thankfully, very few of us are in accidents. But when you are in one, then you don't want to be saying, oh, I wish I'd worn my seatbelt that day.
Okay. John, do you want to come back? Do you want to add on that? Or,
well, yes, maybe just to supplement. I know Aileen was going to come in. I was actually going to move on to the issue of you know, where this to proceed in the promotion. Would you see a role for the Scottish Government specifically in promoting this, and a role for, indeed, pupils and parents? And would there be a willingness on the part of, I appreciate you don't speak for all pupils and all parents, but would you engage with the Scottish Government in promotional material, or how do you think this should be progressed? Where the bill to proceed, please?
I think absolutely, and I think to return to your previous point, it's absolutely right that you know, whatever legislation you're talking about, if people choose to ignore it, then it could be compromised. But I do think there is a carrot and a stick here. And the carrot or the stick rather, is the legislation. I think there's a lot of work that can be done, and that is done in other realms, you know, whether it's around road safety or drug use or alcohol use or knife crime, or, you know, there are lots of examples of really good work going on that is specifically addressing behaviours. So, you know, you have to use the example of that work and say, okay, what can we do around the issue of seatbelt wearing? Because isn't it funny, you know, teenagers will get into a car and they will just automatically do that. They won't even think, well, the ones I know anyway, they wouldn't even think about not wearing their seatbelt. So it's in their head. They already know that's what you do. I don't think it's a massive leap to get them to do that when they're in a school bus.
In on that.
I think in terms of like the promotion of it, if you get young people involved, like videos you make have young people talking to them rather than an adult or a teacher, the older ones are going to respond better. And I think the issue with it is a lot of the behaviour on the buses in terms of not wearing your seatbelt and maybe messing around is probably secondary school buses with older pupils, like so 4th to 6th year, where they've maybe gotten a bit too confident on the bus and things, and they kind of see it as, oh, it's not my responsibility to be wearing the seatbelt or things. If there is one, if there's not, then they're not seeing a seatbelt that's keeping them in their seats. So that's why they're getting up and walking around. So I think it's about making sure that the older young people know that they're sort of need to set the example for the younger ones. And as the younger ones stop seeing the older young people mess about, they're going to learn the behaviour to sit in the bus and sit with their seatbelt on. And I think that's where it comes in on working with the schools. So maybe establish a group of older young people who are on the school bus who maybe go around and check that people are wearing their seatbelts, but do it in a way that's not telling them what to do. It's the case of, look, you need to be wearing your seatbelt because this, and this, and it's not any sort of punishment. I think it's about encouraging rather than punishing the young people, as I think any sort of punishment is just going to turn it completely the other way as they get older, as it will be more resentful rather than a partnership.
John, do you want to?
No, I think included. Joanna, you felt that was covered by the other speakers here? Yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Rhoda, could I ask you for the next question?
Yes, and it's something we've touched on previously about how we enforce seatbelt wearing. And I think it was Eileen that you'd said that, you know, if a parent has to make sure that the child is wearing a seatbelt in a car, then surely the bus driver can do the same in a bus. And I'm just wondering if that is actually workable, or whether we need somebody else on the bus making sure, given bus driver is more than you know, 3 or 4 people to monitor. And just imagining the situation, I suppose I would sooner the bus driver was concentrating on driving rather than monitoring what's going on behind in the bus. Do you think the bill needs to be strengthened in that there is somebody on the bus keeping an eye?
If we went left to right, my left, your right.
I completely understand what you're saying, that actually the driver's attention needs to be on the road, and you know, and we know that distractions, whether it's car phones or children fighting in the back of your car, you know, don't do much for your driving abilities, and the same will apply for bus drivers. So I think there is something there about, you know, if there is a pattern of behaviour where young folk are not wearing seat belts, that there has to be some sort of intervention. I don't know how that would work. I don't know who that would be, you know, whether it would be a member of school staff. I mean, in fact, in many rural areas, you'll find that school staff do also travel on those same buses, but they won't actually have a specific role during the travel time. So, yeah, I'd be, you know, interested to explore what that could look like and who could take on that responsibility.
Anna, do you want to come in on that?
I think it gets back into the not enforcing something. It's about understanding why you might want to not do it. And we've talked about parents and the young people in the schools, but I suppose part of that has to then go back to the people that are, you know, the bus staff and the people that are running the bus, or the drivers, or whomever that happens to be. It's another important part of this group of different, you know, people. So I suppose it would be interesting to find out from that, I'm sure you already have, from that point of view, what they think, and not in a way to try and say, well, we don't want to do it and wash our hands of it, but in a way of how it could be, what they think would be the best option. And if it is to do with, as you say, a parent could be standing at the bus stop and safely strap their young person in, although I would like to know, I would hesitate to do that with, you know, your teenage children. You know, that would be the last thing that any of them would want you to do, is be anywhere near them. But even you could be there, safely strap them in, get off the bus, and they could have it off, the seatbelt off before you even turned the corner. So we have to get back to why they want to keep it on, and perhaps schools need to think of schemes that reward young people for keeping the seatbelt on, rather than punishing them for taking it off, and you be imaginative about things, that we perhaps are looking at things in a different direction.
Sian, do you want to?
Yeah, I think in terms of like a scheme for sort of rewarding young people, I know my school did it with littering around the school, so it was the case of if you were seen putting your litter in the bin, there was a chance to win a prize in a raffle. You got given a ticket, and you people won like vouchers for the shops in the local town and things. So I think something sort of like that, maybe not on such a large scale, but in terms of maybe recognising when young people do put their seatbelt on, especially with the younger age group. Quite often it's quite competitive to get praise and things, especially with like sort of S1 and 2. They quite often like to be told, oh, you're doing really well with this, whereas perhaps maybe with the older ones it's more about giving them sort of a sense of responsibility about wearing their seatbelt rather than being told to wear it. It's more that something they're doing for themselves rather than just for the bus driver to stop them getting on at them.
Thank you. Ready? Do you want to?
The legislation as it stands only makes it clear that there should be seat belts fitted on the buses. It does nothing about the wearing of seat belts, because that's a reserved issue. We spoke to the Scottish Government officials about this and asked the question about local parentis, and if they weren't wearing the seat belts, which isn't required in the legislation, and there was an accident and someone got hurt, you know, where would the responsibility lie on this? Their response was that needs to be tested in the courts. Do you think we need to strengthen the bill? Are you happy that the bill is strong enough on this?
Eileen, would you like to? I'm just trying to think. I mean, it's a very difficult question on where responsibility lies, and I'm mindful of what you said earlier about parents thinking that seatbelts are there. and the school being considered parentis in, like, you know, when the child's with them.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in terms of risk and managing risk and so on, the contract is between the local authority and the bus company. So it would seem to me that actually it becomes a local authority responsibility to ensure that the buses are to a standard, and we also in our evidence talked about the maintenance and so on of school transport being another issue, which again, you know, comes up regularly. So ensuring that the companies maintain the buses properly, provide seat belts, and if there were an accident, then I think, you know, it would seem to me that it's a local authority responsibility. Not that anyone would like that answer, but you know, I think that would be the case because the bus company is contracted to the local authority.
Does anyone want to add to that? I mean, it's quite a tricky question. Jani, you're raising your eyebrows. I'm not sure whether that means you want to add to it or not.
I suppose it's back to thinking out of the box a wee bit, thinking more imaginatively about why you might want to not put your seatbelt on, when generally everybody knows that it is safe. If there's a seatbelt there, it's the most safe option. And trying to get back to just thinking differently, so that, again, the local authority plays a part in this. They can't just say, well, we contract the buses, so it's up to them. There needs to be, there may need to be in some of the more rural parts of Scotland where kids are on the buses for quite a long time. There needs to be a way of engaging them and keeping them safe, so they're not just being, again, told to sit there for an hour there and an hour back, just because we say so. So that, again, there are other issues that will make the seatbelt wearing kind of a secondary issue, that if you put your seatbelt on and then you've got nothing to do for an hour and sit look out a window in the rain, then it's not great. But carrying on is a much better option. So I suppose we have to think about that, and if it needs to be that the local authorities then have to find a way of having somebody on the bus with the young people, then maybe that is the answer in some cases.
Sian, do you want to come back? There's one further question. Okay, no, was that no? Jamie, you've got the last question on this.
This bill specifically applies to the commuting to and from home and the school. Doesn't include excursions or school trips or anything that happens during the day. Do you think those should be included, or are you happy for those to be left out?
I mean, I think this is something that's worrying the committee. Jana, do you want to start on that?
I think they should be included. In my experience, going out as a parent helper on coaches, essentially, taking young people to events. Now, I can't remember a time where there haven't been seatbelts on the coaches, for example. So, but I think that, again, and again, at that point, because it's during the school day, then there are school staff within and other parents on the bus in the ratio needed for safety. And one of the things you do as a parent helper is go around and make sure every single person's got their seatbelt on. And if they can't put it on, you help them to put it on.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's something that should be included, as they're still the same young people going on that bus as it is the same age group of young people that are going on the bus that are the ones that may be getting the exact same bus into school. So I think it needs to be done, because a lot of the time a school trip is a lot of a longer journey. Like, they might be coming all the way up to Edinburgh from somewhere rather than just down the road to the school. So it's more the case of making sure that it's all bases are covered. Like, you don't want there to be a little loophole somewhere where they can just get a cheap bus in to save money on this school trip. It needs to be covered to make sure that young people are safe and that they know that their rights and sort of responsibility to wear a seatbelt. And it actually might help encourage young people to make sure they wear their seatbelt if they're told on school trips by staff who are there that they should be wearing it.
Eileen, would you like?
I would agree, and again it goes back to, you know, school is in loco parentis. You know, they have to look after my children.
Thank you. So that's all three agreed. There is actually one further question which Mike's going to ask, and that will then conclude it. Sorry, Mike.
Thanks, Convener. We're told with the memorandum that goes with the bill that there were about 110 buses without seatbelts in Scotland. And in fact, the majority of local authorities already have this as a requirement. And the Scottish So the Strathclyde Partnership for Transport already told us that actually their local authorities are moving along with this. So the vast majority of local authorities already have this requirement to have seatbelts on those. So my question really is, can you give us any insight from your experiences or any feedback that you've had from people across the country where this is the norm, that we've already got seatbelts in buses, how local authorities actually dealt with the wearing of seatbelts? I mean, they're there already in the vast majority of places, so how are they dealing? How are the current lot of local authorities who have this requirement already dealing with this issue of safety, and has it improved safety?
Eileen, I'm very happy to set brief answers, or if you have no experience, just to say.
Direct experience, I'm sorry.
Okay, so that's, and Joanna, Sian.
Well, from young people I've spoken to about this when we were doing our sort of report, I spoke to a couple of young people myself that I knew got school buses to school, and there is seat belts as their coaches that they get into school, so they quite often say that a lot of young people sit up the back and not put a seat belt on and mess around, which I think is something that schools are still needing to address. But I think if there was legislation where maybe the local authority becomes more legally liable for the young people not wearing their seatbelt or not encouraging them to wear their seatbelts, then they might be more willing to actually put in some sort of steps to make sure that the bus drivers or the young people are making sure that seatbelts are being worn even if they're there.
Thank you. That is all the questions that we have. I think it's been a very interesting session for us, and it's been very informative. I personally, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank the Scottish Youth Parliament for the research they've done. And there are also a list of primary schools that came into the Parliament and contributed through the education services to that. And there are various other people who put in responses, which we've all read and been part of the paper. And I'd also like to thank the three of you for spending the time and coming in. It's always very interesting to hear the views of the people who actually will be working with it and have seen it working on the ground. So thank you very much for your time. And I'm briefly going to suspend the meeting now to change witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I thought you... Thank you. And I'd like to move to the fifth item on the agenda, the subordinate legislation. This is a negative instrument as detailed on the agenda. The committee will now consider any issues it wishes to raise in reporting that to the Parliament. The members should note that no motions to annul have been received in relation to this instrument. There have also been no representations to the committee on this instrument. Does any member of the committee want to make comment on the instrument? Therefore, is the committee agreed that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. The final item is going to be taken in private session. Therefore, I'd like to close the meeting at this stage to move into private session.